Nightmare labyrinth of death and deception. I'm Timothy, and as always, here with me, my good friend Tom. Tonight, we're going to discuss a film called The Cube, as always. Spoilers ahead. The Cube is a 1997 Canadian independent science fiction horror film about individuals trapped in a maze-like structure of cube-shaped room where they must navigate through deadly traps to survive and escape. So, Tom, what do you think about The Cube?
Well, Tim, I must say that I found The Cube to be quite intriguing. It's certainly not my usual cup of tea when it comes to films, but the premise was unique and had me hooked from the start. I particularly liked how they introduced each character through their individual narratives before bringing them all together in this nightmarish maze. The pacing was well done. It didn't take too long for things to get going, which kept my interest up throughout the movie.
Yes, Tom, I agree with you on that point. The Cube did manage to keep me engaged from start to finish as well. However, I must admit that some of the character development left something to be desired, in my opinion. For instance, while we do get a sense of who these people are and how they ended up in this situation, there is still something lacking in terms of understanding their motivations or relationships with one another beyond surface level interactions.
Well now, Tim, I think that was part of the film's charm. It didn't focus too much on character development, but rather kept us guessing about why they were there and how each individual would react under such extreme circumstances. The movie relied more on tension and suspense, which worked quite well in this case, Imho.
I see your point there, Tom, and I suppose it does add to the overall atmosphere of uncertainty and dread. However, I can't help but feel like a deeper exploration into these characters' backstories could have enriched their arcs and made them more memorable in retrospect. But moving on from that discussion for now, let's talk about some of the other aspects of The Cube. What did you think about the film's use of special effects and practical sets?
Well, Timothy, I must say that I was quite impressed with both aspects of the film. Considering its low budget, the production team did an amazing job creating this labyrinthine world with so many intricate details in each room. The traps were also very well designed and executed, which added to the overall sense of claustrophobia and danger that permeated throughout the movie. As for special effects, they kept it minimal but effectively used CG when necessary without detracting from the realism of the setting.
Yes, I completely agree with you, Tom. The practical sets were truly outstanding. They created a very tangible sense of confinement and oppression that enhanced the tension in every scene. And you're right about the special effects as well. They were used sparingly but effectively when necessary, which is always refreshing to see in films these days. Now, moving on from technical aspects of the film, let's talk about some of its themes and underlying messages, if any. What do you think The Cube is trying to say about human nature or society at large?
Well, Timothy, I believe that The Cube serves as an allegory for humanity's struggle against authoritarian systems or structures that seemingly have control over our lives without us truly understanding their purpose or intentions. It highlights how easily individuals can be manipulated and exploited under these conditions, leading to fear, paranoia, and ultimately despair. Additionally, it raises questions about the nature of reality itself. Is this maze-like structure a metaphor for our own existence, where we are constantly navigating through seemingly random events without any real understanding or control?
That's an interesting perspective, Tom. I never really considered The Cube as having such deep philosophical undertones before. But after hearing your analysis, it does make sense. It does seem that the film is trying to explore themes of free will and determinism within a confined environment where characters have little control over their situation or fate. However, what do you think about the ending? Do you find it satisfying, or does it leave more questions than answers?
Well, Tim, I found the ending to be quite ambiguous, which I believe adds to its rewatchability factor. While we get some sense of resolution with certain characters' fates being revealed or resolved, others remain open-ended, leaving viewers to draw their own conclusions about what happens next. Personally, I appreciate this approach as it allows for multiple interpretations and encourages further discussion about the film's themes and messages.
Well, Tom, I'm glad you enjoyed the ambiguity of the ending as much as I did, because it certainly added another layer of intrigue to this already fascinating film. Now, moving on from our discussion about themes and messages, let's talk about some interesting behind-the-scenes tidbits about the cube. Did you know that originally the film was supposed to have a much darker tone with even more graphic violence and gore? In fact, one of the early drafts included a character who was brutally killed by being impaled through both eyes. However, the producers decided to scale back on these elements in order to keep the film's suspenseful atmosphere intact.
That's really interesting, Timothy. I had no idea about those early drafts and the violence that was originally planned for the film. It just goes to show how much can change during the production process, and sometimes scaling back on certain elements can actually improve a project overall. Speaking of which, did you know that some of the sets used in the cube were later reused? In another popular Canadian sci-fi series called Orphan Black. Apparently, they shared a similar minimalistic aesthetic and practical approach to creating their environments.
No way. I didn't know that, Tom. It just goes to show how versatile some of these sets can be when designed with care and attention to detail. And speaking of details, one other fascinating thing about the cube is the fact that each room had its own unique color scheme, which was carefully planned out by production designer Lisa Soper. She even went so far as to create a detailed keychain with all the colors and corresponding room numbers for easy reference during filming. It's amazing how much thought goes into creating these seemingly simple environments in films like this one.
Indeed, Timothy, I couldn't agree more. The attention to detail in the cube really adds to its overall atmosphere and effectiveness as a horror film. And speaking of which, what did you think about the score for the movie? Did it help enhance your viewing experience? Or do you think it could have been done differently?
Well, Tom, I thought the score was quite effective in creating tension and unease throughout the film without being overly intrusive. It relied heavily on minimalist electronic sounds mixed with eerie ambient noises, which served to amplify our characters' sense of isolation and vulnerability. Within this labyrinthine world, they found themselves trapped in. While it might not be the most memorable score I've ever heard, I think it did its job quite well given the constraints of the film's budget and atmosphere.
I have to agree with you on that point, Tim. The score certainly didn't detract from my enjoyment of the movie. And as you mentioned before, they made great use of their limited resources in creating an immersive auditory experience throughout. Now let me ask you this. If given the chance, would you like to see a potential reboot or sequel to The Cube? Or do you think it's best left as a standalone film?
That's an interesting question, Tom. While I appreciate the originality and impact of the first film, I also can't help but feel that there might be some potential for further exploration or expansion in this universe if done right. Perhaps a reboot with a new cast and updated special effects could breathe fresh life into the franchise while still maintaining its core themes and atmosphere. As for a sequel, it would depend on how well they could continue to develop the story without feeling too repetitive or contrived. What about you, Tom? Do you think there's potential for more Cube-related content in the future?
Well, Timothy, I think both options could have their merits, but it really depends on how they approach it. If done right, a reboot or sequel could build upon the existing lore while offering something fresh and exciting for new audiences to enjoy. As for special effects and filming techniques employed in The Cube, I was quite impressed by how they managed to create such a claustrophobic atmosphere using minimal sets and practical effects. The way they utilized forced perspective and optical illusions in some of the scenes really added to the overall sense of disorientation experienced by both characters and viewers alike. Additionally, I thought the lighting was quite effective in highlighting certain elements within each room, while also obscuring others, which added an extra layer of tension and uncertainty throughout the film.
I couldn't agree more, Tom. The special effects in The Cube were definitely one of its strongest points. Not only did they manage to create a convincingly labyrinthine environment using modular sets, but also utilize some ingenious camera work and editing techniques to emphasize our characters' sense of confusion and disorientation within these confined spaces. One particular scene that stands out in my mind is when the cube starts spinning, which not only causes the characters to lose their bearings, but also creates a visceral sensation of vertigo for the viewer as well. The use of practical effects such as smoke machines, strobe lights, and even water were also expertly employed throughout the film, adding another layer of realism and tension where needed.
That's an excellent point, Tim. The use of practical effects was indeed quite impressive in The Cube. It just goes to show that sometimes old-school techniques can still pack a punch when done right. Now let me ask you this. Do you think the film would have had the same impact if it were filmed in color instead of black and white? Or does the monochromatic palette add an extra layer of depth and atmosphere to the overall experience?
That's a really interesting question, Tom. While I appreciate the aesthetic appeal of black and white cinematography, I also can't help but feel that The Cube might have benefited from having some color in its palette as well. On one hand, the monochromatic look does create a sense of uniformity and consistency throughout the film, which helps emphasize our characters' plight as they navigate this bizarre world without any clear understanding of their surroundings or purpose. However, I think adding some carefully selected colors could have added another layer of visual interest while still maintaining that cold, sterile atmosphere present in most of the film. It would have been an interesting experiment to see how the story might have unfolded with a more colorful palette, but ultimately it's hard to say whether or not it would have improved the overall experience.
I see your point, Timothy. It's definitely food for thought regarding how different creative choices can impact the overall experience of a film like The Cube. Now, let's talk about the actors and their portrayals of these complex characters within this unique setting. First off, what did you think about the performance of Nicole DeBoer as Cassandra Rains? Her character goes through quite an emotional arc throughout the film as she struggles with grief and guilt, while also trying to maintain her sanity in such a confined space.
I thought Nicole DeBoer did an excellent job portraying Cassandra Rains Thomas. She managed to convey a wide range of emotions from fear and confusion to anger and resignation throughout the film without ever coming across as melodramatic or over the top. Her character's backstory added another layer of depth to her motivations and behavior, which helped make her more relatable even in such extreme circumstances. I particularly liked how she evolved from being somewhat timid and reserved, at first into a more assertive leader figure by the end of the film.
Truly, Timothy. Her character arc was quite impressive given the constraints of both time and space within the cube. Now let's talk about Nikki Guadagni as Dr. Helen Holloway. What did you think about her portrayal of this compassionate but ultimately flawed individual?
I found Nikki Guadagni's performance as Dr. Helen Holloway to be quite compelling, Thomas. She managed to convey both the empathetic nature of her character and her growing desperation over their situation in a believable manner. I also liked how she developed from being somewhat aloof or distant at first into someone who was more willing to engage with others on an emotional level as the story progressed. However, I do feel that some of her actions later on in the film could be seen as somewhat questionable, given her professional background, which makes me wonder if perhaps she wasn't harboring some deeper issues or insecurities beneath her surface.
That's an interesting point, Timothy. It definitely adds another layer of complexity to Dr. Holloway's character, which in turn contributes to the overall depth and realism of the Cube. Now let's move on to discussing David Hewlett as Simon Wren. What did you think about his portrayal of this troubled but ultimately resourceful individual?
I thought David Hewlett did an excellent job bringing Simon Wren to life, Thomas. He managed to convey both the character's sense of desperation and determination quite effectively throughout the film without ever veering into caricature or overacting. I particularly liked how his character evolved from being somewhat antagonistic or suspicious at first into someone who was more willing to work with others for their collective survival by the end of the story. His resourcefulness and problem-solving skills were also quite impressive, given the circumstances they found themselves in, which added an extra layer of tension and unpredictability to their plight within the Cube.
Truly, Tim. All the actors did a fantastic job bringing these complex characters to life, but I think it's safe to say that David Hewlett's portrayal of Simon Wren was particularly memorable given how much his character evolved over the course of the film. Now let's discuss Andrew Miller as Levin, who seemed to be the mathematical genius of the group. What did you think about his performance in this role?
I found Andrew Miller's portrayal of Levin to be quite fascinating, Tom. He managed to convey both the character's intense intellectual curiosity and his growing sense of despair or helplessness within their situation quite effectively. His ability to piece together clues about the Cube's origins and purpose through mathematics added an extra layer of intrigue and tension to the story, which kept me engaged throughout the film. However, I do feel that some of his actions later on in the film could be seen as somewhat rash or impulsive, given the circumstances they found themselves in, which made me question whether or not he was truly able to handle the psychological strain of their predicament.
That's a valid point, Tim. It just goes to show how even the most intelligent and capable individuals can be affected by extreme stress and isolation in situations like this one. Now let's move on to discuss Julian Richings as Quentin McNeil, who seemed to have some hidden agenda within the Cube. What did you think about his portrayal of this enigmatic character?
I found Julian Richings' performance as Quentin McNeil to be quite chilling at times, Tom. He managed to convey both the character's outwardly charming and affable demeanor alongside his more sinister or manipulative tendencies in a very convincing manner, which kept me guessing about his true intentions throughout the film. His backstory as an undercover police officer who was forced into hiding after killing a fellow officer added another layer of complexity to his character, which made him all the more unpredictable and compelling as a result.
Truly, Tim, it's fascinating how Julian Richings managed to bring out such a multifaceted, complex character's performance even with limited screen time. Now let's move on to discuss the supporting actors such as Wayne Robson, Maurice Dean Wong, and others who all did an impressive job bringing their respective chartersters to life. That's very true, Tim. All of these performances really brought the Cube to life and made it a truly memorable film watching experience for me personally. Speaking of other films or TV shows that were influenced by the Cube, I can't help but think about the recent Netflix series, The Platform, which shares several similarities with our movie here. What are your thoughts on that show and its connection to the cube?
Well, Thomas, I must say that while I have not seen The Platform, I've heard plenty of people draw comparisons between the two works. It seems that both stories explore themes of isolation, survival, and social hierarchy in a confined setting, which makes sense given how popular this type of narrative has become over the years. I think it's safe to say that the cube certainly left its mark on popular culture as we know it, and continues to influence storytellers even today.
Unquestionably, Timothy. It's fascinating how a single film or TV show can spark so much creativity and inspiration within the industry. And speaking of inspiration, I think it's also worth mentioning that the cube has been credited with influencing several other films and shows such as Saw, Cube Zero, and even the popular video game Portal, which features a similar concept of solving puzzles in a confined environment. What are some of your favorite examples of media that were influenced by the cube?
Well, Thomas, I must say that while I don't necessarily have any specific favorite examples beyond what we've already discussed, it is clear that the impact of the cube on popular culture has been significant, from video games to television shows and even other films. The influence can be seen in many different forms, which just goes to show how powerful and enduring this particular narrative has proven to be. Personally, I think one of the most interesting aspects of the cube's legacy is how it continues to inspire new works long after its initial release, which speaks volumes about its lasting appeal and cultural impact.
Indeed, Timothy. It's amazing how a single film can have such far-reaching effects on the media landscape as we know it. And speaking of effects, I think we should take some time to discuss the visual effects in the cube, which were quite impressive for their time, considering the limited budget they had at their disposal. What are your thoughts on how well these effects held up over the years?
Well, Tom, while it's true that the visual effects in the cube were impressive considering its modest budget and the technology available at the time of its release, I must admit that they do show their age somewhat when compared to more modern films or TV shows. However, this doesn't detract from my overall enjoyment of the film, as the story and characters are still compelling even without the most cutting-edge special effects. In fact, I think part of the cube's charm lies in its reliance on practical set design and props, which adds to its authenticity and immersion factor.
I couldn't agree more, Timothy. It just goes to show that sometimes less is more when it comes to visual effects in filmmaking. And speaking of immersive storytelling, let's wrap things up by discussing how the cube succeeds in creating a sense of claustrophobia and isolation throughout its runtime, which ultimately elevates the overall viewing experience for audiences. What are some of your favorite moments or scenes that contribute to this atmosphere?
Well, Tom, there are several moments in the cube that do an excellent job creating a sense of claustrophobia and isolation, such as when the characters are trapped within a room with no apparent exit, or when they're forced to confront their own mortality due to the dangerous nature of their environment. One particular scene that stands out for me is when Dr. Holloway discovers the body of another character floating in an adjoining room, which not only serves as a powerful visual metaphor for their hopeless situation, but also drives home just how dire things have become within the cube. Overall, I think it's safe to say that the cube succeeds in creating a truly immersive and unsettling atmosphere throughout its runtime, which is a testament to the skill of both its cast and crew.
Indeed, Timothy. It's clear that The Cube is a film that has stood the test of time and continues to resonate with audiences even today. Its themes of claustrophobia, isolation, survival, and human nature under Extreme stress are as relevant as ever, which is why it remains such. A compelling watch for both newcomers and longtime fans alike. And while we may not always agree on the finer points of these types of films, Tom, I think it's safe to say that The Cube is a true classic that deserves its place in the annals of horror science fiction cinema.
Indeed, Tom. It's been an absolute pleasure discussing this film with you tonight. For those of you watching at home, we hope you enjoyed our lively discussion as much as we did. And remember to comment, subscribe, and like the video if you did, so that we can continue bringing you more in-depth analyses and debates on your favorite films here at Tim and Tom's Film Nights. Until next time, folks, good night, Britain.